Good morning, everyone in United States, and good evening to our expert panelists in India because they are joining on a Saturday evening, 7:30 p.m. We are here present once again to join another session of roundtable discussion organized by the Council for Strategic Affairs. And I've started to share my screen, so there will be few slides. This is the logo of the Council for Strategic Affairs. And the topic for today's roundtable discussion is political instability in Sri Lanka. As we know, in South Asia, Sri Lanka is an important country, a country of 22 million people. This was the flyer that people registered. We come back to the map of Sri Lanka here. And this is the President of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And I'm pretty sure you will have discussion about this gentleman, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the former president and former prime minister of Sri Lanka, recently resigned. And this is the new Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was previously the leader of opposition. And I will start with a little bit of introduction about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations. It fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. It encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness, and CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. We have a monthly roundtable discussion every second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime in US, that is 7:30 p.m. in India. We have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert, and I know Professor Nalapat has been one of the domain experts for us and has participated in several roundtable discussions. CSA organizes symposia, meetings, and conferences. It promotes publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. CSA also is organizing a summer internship program. And one thing which is very, very important is that we do not sort of encourage and we condemn terrorism in any form because terrorism is a worldwide problem. So CSA does not condone terrorism. So today we had panel of three experts, and we still have panel of three experts: Professor and Dean Sreeram Chaulia, Professor Madhav Nalapat, and Dr. K. Sachithananthan. Dr. Siddhartha was supposed to also join, but he has some medical issues, so he will not be able to join. I'll quickly run through the panelists. Professor Chaulia is going to be late, so I would not start with him. This is his picture, and I will introduce him when he joins. So then this is Professor Madhav Nalapat. Professor Nalapat is Professor and Dean of International Relations and Geopolitics. He held the first UNESCO Peace Chair in India at University of Manipal. He has been a journalist and editor of Mathrubhumi. Currently, he is editor-in-chief of Sunday Guardian. His research is focused on security, geopolitics, and defense-related matters. He has written multiple number of books, so I am not going to spend more time actually introducing the speakers because that cuts the time for the speakers. The more I speak about their introduction, so I'm going to let it pass. And this is Dr. K. Sachithanand Nandan, who is of Sri Lankan origin. And, I'm very glad that he was able to join us. Has had an illustrious career. He has a Doctor of Science from Katpakkam University in Coimbatore, India. He had MSc degree in zoology with marine biology from University of Madras. He has been in multiple civil services positions and posts. His resume was so big that I decided not to go over it. He is a polyglot. He knows multiple languages: Tamil, English, Sinhalese, Japanese, Arabic. He's member of a number of professional societies. He has been a consultant for United Nations, and being the only person in this panel of Sri Lankan origin, I thought that it would be very good to, have him as part of our roundtable discussion. So we get an insider's view about what's going on in Sri Lanka. A little bit of housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration modes. Please do not try to interrupt our esteemed speaker when they are speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to pose questions. No anonymous questioners, please. Please send all your questions through the chat function, and later on I will read the question one by one. The questions need to be very specific. It cannot be detailed comments or a kind of monologue. And lastly, we are recording this session, so everyone should be able to sort of you know uh, view the recordings of this session. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint screen, and I will start with our first speaker. I'm very glad that Professor Chaulia was able to join us in time. He told me that he will be joining 10 minutes late because he's traveling. He's in Pune. He is, promoting his latest book, The Crunch Time. Professor Chaulia is professor and dean of International School of International Relations at OP Jindal University in Haryana. He has been a domain expert for us. He has given distinguished lectures, and we are very honored to start this uh, roundtable discussion with Professor Chaulia. Since we have three distinguished panelists, I will request each panelist to give around 15 minutes of presentation, and rest of the time will be on question and answer session. So, Professor Chaulia, please, the honor is yours.
Thank you, Adityanjee. Namaste to everyone. Really honored to be back with Council for Strategic Affairs, a very important discussion forum and think tank that's bridging the gap between the diaspora with India. And I know among the Indian American community is very highly respected. So it's always an honor to be speaking on your forum, Adityanjee. Thank you for inviting me, and also greetings to co-panelists who are themselves very distinguished scholars and thinkers. I'll just start by laying out what I believe are the fundamental causes for this catastrophic collapse that we are seeing in Sri Lanka. Ironically, the military defeat of the Tamil Tigers more than a decade ago in the bloody end game of the civil war sowed the seeds for what we are seeing today. And how so? Well, it created the basis for an extreme authoritarian dictatorship of a clan of thuggish politicians. I'm sorry, I'm not going to mince words. How else can you describe the Rajapaksa family? The kind of extreme power they accumulated in the name of national security, in the name of freeing the country from decades of insurgency. It went to an extent where they amended the constitution and granted extraordinary powers to the what was already known as an executive presidency, became even more um, kind of a Jupiterian kind of a version of executive power, that like an emperor. That's how under Gotabaya and his brothers and his entire clan, what they have done is tampered with the fundamentals of democracy in Sri Lanka. And this is where they allowed things to go out of control, because when you have no checks and balances left in the country, then you can resort to all kinds of whimsical policies and foolhardy measures that end up backfiring. You can see that in other parts of the world. For example, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey is almost now 20 years is in power, and is plunging the country deeper and deeper into economic collapse and repeated bouts of instability, all because there are very few checks and balances left against this man. I don't have to mention the fact that the decision by Russia to attack Ukraine was also a manifestation of this similar phenomenon. We are all lovers of Russia generally, historically, and we believe in the partnership with Russia, but we've been disappointed with what has happened last 2 3 months, and we are not supporting by any means the invasion of a sovereign country. We just took a call based on national interest, but we are not supporting Russian actions in Ukraine. So I think you can see how power can get into your head. What is the saying? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is the story, I'm sorry, the tragedy of Sri Lanka. And from hero to zero, how you can just transform in just a few years. They just won a landslide victory and came back to power, the Rajapaksas, just a few years ago. And all of it again on the riding on the coattails of national security after the Easter bombings by ISIS-inspired terrorists. The Rajapakshas stormed back to power because they were seen as the only protectors of the nation against jihadist extremism. Earlier, they were against Tamil extremism. Now it is against jihadist extremism. The problem with this um, single point agenda for legitimacy is that it wears away, because once you have crushed the extremists, how can you keep on saying that I'm defending the nation against foreign forces or against enemies of Buddhism or enemies of Sinhalese people? So the irony, the supreme irony, which I would like all of you to dwell upon, is Mahinda Rajapaksha, as per the reports, the former president and the brother, now has become former prime minister, has been whisked away to Trincomalee in the East Coast under special forces and Air Force protection for his life, because he is not safe in the single areas where people are up in arms. Can there be a more supreme irony that Mahinda Rajapaksa is hiding in the East, which is Tamil speaking majority, Trincomalee? So this just shows you the wheel has come full circle. And really, I believe that the democratic backsliding, or almost the destruction of democracy and of all the institutions that Rajapaksha clan resorted to, is now showing its results. If there were institutions of checks and balances, just go back to basic political theory: separation of powers, legislature, executive, judiciary, fourth estate, media. If you encroach on all these things, tamper with the constitution, then you have this kind of disaster. And then you make colossal policy mistakes. Everyone knows about their the diktat to go for organic farming and how it brought about a collapse in agriculture. And of course, you can argue they also had some bad luck because of timing, because the tourism industry also collapsed due to the COVID-19 crisis. But you cannot absolve them of the fundamental macroeconomic policy mistakes and errors they made that were disastrous. And of course, the bigger problem of the wrong foreign policy choices they made. Now it's quite evident the chickens have come home to roost. The kind of unsustainable debt that they accumulated with China. And where are the Chinese now? Why are they not coming to bail out this country? Why is India giving more than $3.5 billion out of solidarity? Where are the Chinese? Why are they not writing off all their debts if they really believe in win-win cooperation with developing countries? So this is a classic example of a unaccountable um, almost dictatorial or an elected authoritarian regime that went out of hand, courted the Chinese to the detriment of the people of Sri Lanka, and now they are no longer able to hide the reality from public view, and now they are paying a heavy price for it. So I think both the domestic institutional makeup of Sri Lanka as well as the foreign policy mistakes, these two have to be revised now and have to be relooked at if at all it has to come back to health. It's a supreme irony that Sri Lanka, which was considered to be one of the moderately prosperous countries in South Asia, one of the better managed economies in South Asia, even during the war, the peak of the war, they had not bungled the economy like this. How can, and then by the way, I haven't even gone into corruption and nepotism and the way the clan has accumulated wealth. All of it adds up. We can name 6 7 factors for the current collapse, but the fundamental reason is that democracy had gone for a toss, and people, there was no popular will reflected in policy making, and therefore there were all these arbitrary reasons and decisions and policies that brought about this disaster. So I believe that both the domestic restoration of democracy within Sri Lanka, as well as the rebalancing of foreign policy away from this deadly embrace of China, without these two preconditions, they are going to be mired in crisis after crisis, and more coming back to a kind of a civil war like situation. This country has a background. I worked in Sri Lanka for 2.5 years during the war from 2003 to 2005 as a peacekeeper, and I still remember the basic insecurity that people of all ethnic groups feel was quite evident even at the time, and it's come back in a different way now. And the kind of clashes we're talking about, political violence on the streets, it doesn't have an ethnic character, at least as far as I can see. But the conflict that was abruptly ended through a kind of a spree of mass killing in 2008 2009, that could also re-erupt as the state collapses. So I think it's very important for us to think about means of stabilizing this country, but understand the underlying problem which I have tried to lay out. So thank you for this. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia. I am really very thankful that, while you are in Pune, you were able to join and enlighten us with our views. And I'm going to request our next speaker, Dr. K. Sachithananthan. And as I said, that he is of Sri Lankan origin, although currently he's based in Chennai, but he has lived through the tough times in Sri Lanka. So we would like him to give his, opinion and his comments. So Dr. Sachithananthan, please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me, everybody?
Yes, we are able to hear you.
Hearing? Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. It's a great honor to be with the CSA. It's a great honor to be with the fellow participants of achievers in their own field, great contributors to peace in the world. I think that this meeting is will be an eye-opener for many who will want to know what is happening in Sri Lanka. You have given me 15 minutes, so I will confine myself to one aspect of what I think, because when I speak, I cannot speak for others. The basic problem in Sri Lanka is that there's a mindset which has developed over the last 150 years during the English rule. This mindset developed, and this mindset is going on, and today the country is reaping curse. The mindset is purely a religious ethnic mindset. You have a Buddhist. I'm putting the word Buddhist first, not single. The language comes second. A Buddhist singular majoritarian feeling that Sri Lanka belongs to them and to nobody, and a feeling that everybody should become either Buddhist or Sinhalese or both. This mindset is the cause. Now, if you take 150 years ago, when the English came, they resisted. It's a nationalistic resistance by the Sinhalese people, the Buddhists. Even before the Dutch came, the Portuguese came, they did not allow them to land also. The Portuguese were chased out several times. So there's a nationalistic mindset based on Buddhist philosophy and Sinhalese language. They don't want to give it up easily. This is happening not only in Sri Lanka, even in Myanmar is the same thing. Myanmar also has the same mindset. But unfortunately, other people are also living in that country. Not for 1 year, 2 years, for 200 years or 300 years, for more than the period when Buddhism came to Sri Lanka, more than the period Sinhalese language developed into a coherent base for communication. That country has been habitated by Tamils and Hindus for 10,000 years or more. Somebody who has to work on it has to let us know how many years. But in my reading, I find we have been there for, the Tamil Hindus have been there for 10,000 years or more. And now Buddha comes 2,500 years ago, around that time. At that time, there was no Sinhalese language. There was no Sinhalese heritage. All of us were Tamils. So all of us were Hindus. In fact, when Buddha came for the first time, he is, he has a habit of preaching in places where there are people assembled, and mostly without disturbing the assembly. So when he came, he was the people of Sri Lanka, the Tamils, were in the midst of a festival, Hindu festival. Buddha parked himself in the nearby place and called few people to educate them in his own way, tell them what he felt, went back. He came again, he came thrice. So that was the beginning of Buddhism. Before that, we lived there. Unfortunately, the Sinhalese people think that they belong to the country, not others. So this is the problem that has been going. Now I don't want to go into the other history of past and when the kings and now the English period is my beginning, where the Buddhists felt thoroughly cheated, denationalized the British. They never accepted it. But as in any human grouping or society or nation, there are people who wanted the British. And the last agreement in 1815 with the Kenyan ruler or the Kenyan chieftains gave British people the complete takeover of the island. They took over the island. In 1833, they united the island for one rule. Earlier, during the Portuguese, there were three kingdoms. When the Portuguese came, and the Dutch came, they ruled those separately. But the British united them in 1833, and that was the beginning of the successful onslaught of the single Buddhist, can I say, religious extremism. They in it was with the Muslims. In 1920s, it was the Malayalis. 1930s, it was with the upcountry Tamils. 1948, when the Sri Lanka became independent, First thing they did was not to think about never to denationalize those people who came during the British times. Now, you see, if you're a country, the first thing is absorb everybody, look after everybody, care for everybody, give them the basic amenities, make them work hard, develop progress. That can bring economic progress. Now, today's economic deterioration or economic collapse is due to the 40 around a million Tamils were taken out of their citizenship, voting rights. And 88 without any right. The curse of these people who were languishing 1 million without voting citizenship, just work the economy of the country. They were sleeping, but poorly paid, poorly looked after, poorly educated, not getting the same benefits as the citizens were getting. If those people, maybe openly they did not curse, but their minds, anybody's mind, when you are like this, you naturally get a curse. Then the Sinhalese thought, okay, now we have taken away the Tamil citizenship of the 1 million people. Let us move into the other Tamil. So they made Sinhalese the official language. That was the cause for the economic collapse. Present day is a result. The present day economic collapse is a result of a long drawn out program of racial aggressiveness, and they are not giving it up. I am telling you now. I want to close because I don't want to speak at length. Today, the Prime Minister is Ranil Wickremesinghe. He is going to get the support of whom? The Tamils and the Muslims. They are primarily his supporters. Others are sitting on the fence or half-heartedly supporting him. He is a binami or a proxy for Mahinda Rajapaksa. He is supposed to be a proxy for Mahinda Rajapaksa. So naturally, all the protests which led to this stage from April 3rd is going to continue because the Rajapaksa, maybe Mahinda is gone, but his proxy is there. He is there to protect him. Gotabaya is not yet gone. They came on the 2019 elections, they came on a platform of racism. And Gotabaya announced he is the president for the Sinhalese and the Buddhists. He didn't never announce I am the president for the whole country so that we will see a rosy, developed country, a future where every citizen will have its own food, every citizen will have his own clothing, own shelter. Beyond that, the advantages of this digitization, advantages of this modernity. No, he said, I am the president for the Sinhalese Buddhist people. Do you think that there can be any economic functioning, economic prosperity for a country which repeatedly, for the last 150 years, repeatedly mooring, anchoring its policy on racial supremacy of the Buddhist and the Sinhalese? It will never happen. And now it will not go to happen. That this the protest will now going to be turned against the ethnic Tamils and the ethnic Muslims. I'm sorry to say that, but it appears if the Muslims and the Tamils are going to support Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is going to be a proxy for Rajapaksa, all the anger against Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe will turn against the Tamils and the Muslims for supporting. So this is Ranil or anybody cannot take back for the next 6 months. What effort? It's like somebody told me. It's like a car where there are no spare parts available in the world. It's a broken. It has to be sent to for scrap. It has to be sent to scrap. So to recover from this, one has to be magnanimous. A leader has to be magnanimous. He has to embrace every person, every citizen as his own child, own brother, own sister, own father, own mother, and work for the prosperity of the individual, giving him the innate right to express himself, express himself in terms of words, in terms of deeds. Of course, the laws are there to limit if your liberty crosses limits. Now, Lee Kuan Yew, what he said in 1960s, Sri Lanka is a model. No, 50s. Sri Lanka is a model. Singapore will emulate it. All the natural resources are in Sri Lanka. Plenty of rain, plenty of greenery, plenty of mountains, plenty of space, human resources, but we have no quality leadership. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you, the CSA. Thank you. I thank the project coordinator or the moderator, the fellow participants, and those listeners. I want to be very clear. If we want to get out of it, we want a quality leader who will embrace every person as a Sri Lankan citizen and take him along with him, give him the rights, whatever he asks, if within the ambit of peaceful living. If I want to be on my own, and you continue to say, no, you are not on your own, you will have to under me. Well,
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sachithananthan, for illustrating the historical and ethno-religious factors in Sri Lanka's current plight. Unfortunately, there was some connectivity problem and bandwidth problem. I didn't want to intervene you while you were speaking, but it might be better if you switch off your video and just leave the audio connection during the question and answer session, because pretty much uh, half of the presentation was lost because of connectivity problem. We are sorry for that. I didn't want to intervene in between, but I think we will get Dr. Sachidanandan's viewpoint during the Q&A session. Now we have our final speaker, Professor Madhav Das Nalapat, who is no stranger to this forum. He has been with us several times, and he's our last and the final speaker. So, Professor Nalapat, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanjee, and I'm honored to be here along with such distinguished co-panelists, Professor Chaulia and Dr. Sachithananthan. There's no question about it. And I've been to Sri Lanka multiple times, including during the situation when this huge battle was going on, so far as the LTT was concerned. And of course, I have my own perspective on that. And I've been to, for example, Jaffna and some of the areas controlled by the LTT. And I can't really believe that the Tamil population of those areas welcomed the LTT, in the sense that in the beginning, Prabhakaran was a hero because he stood up for justice, if I may say so. As has correctly been pointed out by Dr. Sachithananthan, the reality is that, back in the 1950s, they tried to impose a policy of only one language, Sinhala. And if I may say so, only the Sinhalas mattered, only their language mattered. And it reached a stage in which if you were a Tamil, you could not get admission to a university. University seats were allotted almost entirely to Sinhalese. And as a consequence, of course, several Tamils went abroad, and you have a flourishing Tamil diaspora, and that diaspora is viscerally opposed to, certainly many of the ruling dynasties, the Bandar Nayakes, Rajapaksas, all of them, because they were forced to flee Sri Lanka, but that became a blessing in disguise because they did extremely well. And I'd also like to say that I quite agree with Dr. Sachithananthan that the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, they are Sri Lankan Tamils. You know, there is a culture separate from country. And in Sri Lanka, over a very considerable period of time, uh, possibly much more than a millennium, they've evolved a very unique culture. And it's very interesting because there were very bad times, frankly, when this battle was going on in the, where the LTT was concerned. And I mean, Dr. Chaulia has gone there as a peacemaker. I've gone there as someone who wanted peace. And frankly, you go to Colombo during the periods, late 80s, 1990s. I mean, there are checkpoints everywhere. There are problems everywhere, and if you look like somebody who's from a Tamil background, well, you had a serious problem at those checkpoints because they were viscerally not just anti-LTT, which is understandable, but anti-Tamil. Unfortunately, in India, we have made multiple mistakes, and one of them was the Shastri-Sirmavo Pact, in which Lal Bahadur Shastri agreed to bring back in the language used lakhs of Sri Lankan Tamils when actually they were Sri Lankans. There's no question of bringing them back. It was a complete injustice to them to uproot them. And that is where, for example, whenever people talk in terms of coming back, homecoming, look, it is the responsibility of India to try and ensure that there is security for individuals, whether it's in Bangladesh, whether it is in Pakistan, whether it is in Afghanistan. You can't just say, no, no, all right, there's no security, so you come to India. That is a default option if we fail in assuring them security. But the main option has got to be assuring them security. And unfortunately, beginning with the Sirimavo Shastri Pact, this perception was there that the Tamils, the same perception that the Bandaranaikes had, frankly. Don't forget the Bandaranaike family that ensured the complete domination of the Sinhala language and complete elimination of the Tamil population from large aspects of Sri Lankan life. And I mean, this is a tragedy because they were extremely talented people and they were completely eliminated. So I think the roots go into that. Of course, Dr. Chaulia has been talking about the Rajapaksa family, and I quite agree. I mean, in the Middle East, you have this Gulf Cooperation Council, and you have the royal families, and I mean, every nephew, every niece, every son-in-law, they're all employed by the government. Sri Lanka almost reminds me of a GCC family because twice over. Once you can understand. But when you repeat the same mistake twice, the people, I think, will take it very badly. And the second time around also, the Rajapaksas had this belief, obviously, that unless you're a Rajapaksa, you shouldn't handle responsibility. And they fill the government with Rajapaksas. Of course, the reality of the situation is it's not one clan. I know, for example, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has considerably different views from, say, Basil Rajapaksa. Uh, Mahinda Rajapaksa has very different views from several other members of the Rajapaksa family. It's a clan with a lot of different. Basil, for example, is completely, if I may say so, enthralled to China, completely. Uh, I mean, there are others there who basically don't like India and they see China as essentially a counter to India, and they love China because China hates India, so to speak. I mean, I'm not saying Chinese hate India, but the Communist Party of China certainly is not very friendly towards India. So that is their perception. But let me only say one thing: the LTT, I can assure you, I don't believe it was very popular in the Tamil areas. I remember, for example, a very interesting visit that I had into the areas controlled by the LTT. And every day I would see individuals go to their offices. They would be in a tie, They would wear a tie, they'd have shoes, and they will just sit in the offices the whole day. They will come at 9 o'clock and leave at 5 o'clock. There is no work. There was no business. There was no trade. There was nothing to do. But rather than stay at home, they would put on their office attire and keep the office open, so to speak, and be in the chair, essentially staring out into space until 5 o'clock when they would go back home. But I admired that kind of refusal, if I may say so, to be crushed. Because the obvious thing would have been stay at home and basically forget everything and just, but they said no, we'll like to keep to a schedule and one day we'll find work. And I think one of the main problems that the Rajapaksas have faced, frankly, and that began when Mahinda was the president and has continued when Gota is the president. And may I confess that I'm not, frankly, I don't have the same feelings as Dr. Chaulia has about them. I know both Gota and Mahinda reasonably. And in their own way, they're very interesting people. But both of them, they made the mistake of refusing to give genuine autonomy to the Tamil areas. And this is today, in today's world, or 25 years ago, you have a very flourishing Tamil diaspora. I'm not just talking about individual Tamils who have done extremely well in business and various other fields all over the world. You look at Canada, look at the United States, look at the UK, look at Germany, all kinds of places. And you find the Tamil community is immensely successful. But then you find in companies, the Tamil community has risen to the top of several companies. And believe me, there was, once the LTT was demolished, and in my view, fortunately so, I frankly, after what they did to Rajiv Gandhi, whatever residual regard I had for them went. And I would like to say that I've had the privilege of meeting Mr. Prabhakaran a few times. Once, in fact, staying in the Ashoka Hotel, just a room away from him when discussions were going on in Delhi. Coincidentally, I was in the same hotel. I was in a room next to his, but these coincidences do happen. And of course, he was a very interesting personality. But when he came into a room, you'd realize this is a man who's complete confidence in himself. But the reality is, he did not create a kind of a structure that allowed even the people whom he claimed to support to really grow. Although it is a fact that he came as a response to, if I may say so, oppression and domination by Sinhala chauvinists. In Dr. Chaulia's evocative word, thugs. And I can assure you, Dr. Chaulia is not simply one family. There are people in every family, including possibly yours and mine, who could probably meet that definition, because we're all human beings. But, this is the mistake they made. They refused to devolve. And Gota, that way, he was the defense secretary. And I must say that very systematically, he went about in this attack on the LTT. And I know there was tremendous pressure from the European Union, from the US, from various countries to basically withdraw and ensure a safe passage to Mr. Prabhakaran. But the reality of the situation is they persevered in that. And I think for that, both these brothers, of all the family, frankly, there are only three people whom I think have got some quality. One is, of course, with all his problems, Mahinda, Gotabaya, and in fact, Mahinda's son, Nemal, who's, coming out. And all three of them know India very well. All three of them come to India regularly and visit temples in India. And when we go to Buddhist holy places and temples in Sri Lanka, you'll always find, you'll always find an idol of a Hindu god or pictures of Hindu goddesses. So after you pay your obeisance to Lord Buddha, you can go and then prostrate before the Hindu gods and goddesses who are there in the Buddhist temple. So It's a very syncretic kind of culture. But I think Sri Lanka is a lesson in the limits of frankly trying to impose one culture or one language or whatever, or of course one family on a country, even a country as small as Sri Lanka. I mean, they fail to do that. And of course, part of the reason is that the Sinhala community also is certainly not a monolith. You have the Goigamas, the Salegamas, and you have multiple communities inside the Sinhala community, all of whom dislike each other much more than they dislike the Tamils, and much more than they ever disliked Indians. They basically dislike different groups inside the Sinhala community. So it's a very complex kind of reality. But I think this particular problem began long back. It began with the Bandar Naikes, and Bandar Naikes were the people who basically were the patrons of the Rajapaksas, of Mahinda definitely, and Sirmawa and others. And it began with that. And I think it shows two or three things very clearly, if I may say so, Dr. Adityanjee. One, for heaven's sake, and again, a very interesting thing about Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankans, for them, paradise was going to Blighty, to England, and they loved England. And all the big Sri Lankan families used to have their holidays back home, and back home was actually England. It was certainly no part of Sri Lanka, but they did not want the English language. This reminds me of India, where one of the few good things the British did was give us the English language, and successive governments have tried to wipe out the English language from India. In Sri Lanka, they almost succeeded in wiping it out, frankly, with the result that for considerable periods of time, English was hardly spoken. The Tamils, by the way, were much more receptive to English than the Sinhalese, and the Tamils therefore got a leg up. Another reason why, they were not very popular in some elements of the population of the Sinhalese, who were not very successful by themselves and did not have the skills to be successful. It's a very complex situation. And I'd like to say, I agree with you completely. I agree with the panelists that you have to have an inclusive policy. You have to have a policy that, for example, foreign investment, if you welcome it, and whether it's the Tamil diaspora or the Sinhala diaspora, which is also a very versatile diaspora, or different other kinds of investments that could come to Sri Lanka, that is the only way out, because internally, if you look at the impossible and say you're going to get the money, ill-gotten gains of politicians back from the politicians, we all know in India, we were supposed to have about $1.3 trillion in Swiss bank accounts. I don't know how much we got, but I think it was a few, maybe less than 100 million, I think, out of that trillion is what we got. So I don't think you'll have better luck in Sri Lanka. The way out is to make Sri Lanka a kind of a haven for investment. For that, there has to be stability. And for that, there has to be some credibility in the government. Now, I can understand I don't think Ranil, for example, has very kindly feelings towards Mahinda. And neither, in my view, does Mahinda have very kindly feelings for Ranil. They are both in a coexistence by circumstances. And of course, people have been talking about Gotabaya must quit. Okay, Gotabaya quit. Somebody else comes. It's not going to make much difference, quite frankly. I quite agree that the problem is very deep-rooted. And the problem, I think, is in Sri Lanka, there has been a perception that, there has been a perception that you look after a certain, economic, you basically look after a kind of a impulse of language and so-called ethnicity, and you pay a lot of attention to that, then you're on top. The Rajapaksa family, the Bandar Naike family, they were basically champions of the Sinhalas. The Bandar Naike family is now history. In fact, the Rajapaksas helped significantly to make them history, and we don't know who's in the wings to make the Rajapaksas history. but they're not yet history. But the reality is, quite frankly, that a country's foundation, stability is built on economics. And if you neglect economics, ethnicity, religion, language, so called culture is not going to save you. The Rajapaksas were champions of the Sinhala language, champions of the Sinhala people. I had no idea Gota was, I mean, so, if I may say so, ill-advised as to say that I am the president of the Sinhalese. He was not that undiplomatic in my meetings with him. That is an extremely surprising thing for anybody to say, even if they felt that internally. It was a very surprising thing, and I'm shocked that he said it. But having said that, I'd like to point out that yes, there has to be a reconfiguration of the situation. I hope it doesn't get much worse before it gets better. And as for Ranil Wickremesinghe, the point about Ranil is he's a very adjustable, flexible chap. Extremely adjustable and flexible. And I have long said that in many, when Narendra Modi went ahead and talked about minimum government and maximum governance, I was delighted because let's be honest, in many situations of policy, minimum government is the best form of government. You give the people freedom to operate and you give the people their own space, they will create for you. There's no question about it. Whereas in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, there has been an over centralization of authority. Colombo, 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 nothing more. Devolution has really never taken place. And even in a small country, you cannot over centralize. So Sri Lanka is showing the limits of ethno-centered politics minus economic growth. Sri Lanka is showing the limits of absence of devolution and centralization of authority. And Sri Lanka is showing the limits of if one particular group of a particular ethnicity or a particular faith, the Buddhist faith. And I'd like to say, I admire Sri Lankan Buddhists for the way they have protected Buddhism in Sri Lanka. It was not protected in India, quite frankly. It was protected, it has been protected, it was protected in Sri Lanka, and a very unique school of Buddhism has evolved in Sri Lanka, which has made Sri Lanka a very special part of the Buddhist world. And I'm happy that Prime Minister Modi is now in Buddha Purnima, he is now drawing attention to the importance of Buddhism because Lord Buddha was one of the great treasures that India gave to humanity.
Thank you,
Like to
Professor
say,
Nalapat.
there are wonderful people. There are
Professor,
wonderful people, the Tamils and the Sinhalese. There, and I hope they can find their way out. I frankly can't see, an easy way out. But I do agree with Dr. Chaulia and Mr. Sachithananthan. It has got to be a situation in which live and let live, accept people as equals, and no chauvinism of any kind whatsoever, including language chauvinism. Thank you.
thank you, Professor Nalapat, for your very exquisite and very lucid comments about the problem. Um, we have some time crunch. Professor Chaulia has to leave in next 6 minutes. So what I would do, I would gear first couple of questions towards Professor Chaulia because he has another engagement, and then have a few of the discussions. So first question is from Anushri Gisad, who sent through chat function. What does this instability in Sri Lanka mean for maritime security and maritime trade of India in the Indian Ocean region? And I'll request Professor Chaulia to take that question.
Thank you. We do have an Indian Ocean Regions Association where Sri Lanka is a member, and over the years we have tried to impress upon them that there are certain red lines that they should not cross as far as India's maritime security is concerned. You may recall that some years ago, when the Rajapaksas were in power in earlier times, in the previous turn, they had invited Chinese PLA Navy submarines to dock in Sri Lanka, and that had raised red flags. Ever since, we have tried to impress upon them that they cannot that this cannot be accepted and there is going to be a cost for it. And in fact, Mahinda, when he lost the election in 2015, he blamed India, saying that India is the one that put together that motley coalition led by Maithripala Sirisena that brought him down. So the point is that the Sinhalese elites, for all their interest in playing the China card and also gaining financially from Chinese loans and investments, the point is they have been told in crystal clear terms that India will not accept this kind of infringement on its backyard and in its sphere of influence. So I think ever since they have at least committed to not hosting Chinese military presence there. But Hambantota port was given away because they were in hock to Sri Lanka, and it's a so-called civilian infrastructure project. But there are high chances that the Chinese will try to securitize or militarize them. So I think we have been working with all kinds of regimes, whether it is Sirisena or Ranil Wickremesinghe or Rajapaksas, with a consistent point of view that we cannot accept this. In fact, the Ali Sabri, who was now just resigned, the most recent finance minister, is on record saying that we cannot afford to have unhappy neighbors, especially not a neighbor like India. So at least now, I think it's very clear the 3.5 billion plus financial assistance that India is given is conditional. We are not making it public. We just didn't throw this as charity or a lifeline. We've told them in clear cut terms, if they do not comply with our security needs, they are not going to be getting even a penny. So I think we are very clear. In fact, some of the power plants which had earlier been awarded to the Chinese are now going to be given to India. So some of the earlier projects where they had chucked us out of and had given them to the Chinese are now going to be reversed. So in that sense, this is a comeuppance for the mistakes they made and by becoming over dependent on China, which is not coming to their rescue when the chips are down. So I think for maritime security, we will want whatever dispensation comes in to continue to respect India's red lines. And now, in a way, we have leverage over them. And we don't like to talk about it publicly because we are seen to be just coming to the rescue, and we are giving humanitarian assistance, fuel, food, you name it, right? Which are being appreciated by all ethnic groups in Sri Lanka because they are all in the same crisis right now, in the same boat. But I think it's quite clear behind the scenes we have driven a bargain, and I think in that sense the crisis is a blessing in disguise because it will help turn around the Sri Lankans from the deadly embrace of the Chinese and to realize who their real friends are, who are their real allies. In Sri Lanka, they had made a politics of anti-India lobby, and they had made a political football out of this. The reality is that the so-called Big Brother India, which interferes and all that, a lot of it is a make-believe for political football, and it happens not only in Sri Lanka, in all the neighboring countries, in Nepal, in Maldives, and even Bangladesh. There are elements who create this anti-India hysteria, which is mostly a concoction. So now they are in no position to even say that India is imposing conditions. Who is going to give unconditional aid when you have ruined yourself? So I think there are conditions involved, and maritime security is our number one condition for us. For Modi government, security first is the doctrine. So we are going to, and as far as the other question of whether it's a setback to China, no doubt about it. But remember something, yeah, whether it is Sirisena regime or whether it was Rajapaksas, because of the sovereign debt, when you take sovereign debt, the successive regimes cannot repudiate or just write them off, because then you will become persona non grata in the capital markets worldwide. So they cannot repudiate and just write off all the debts unless China decides, as a creditor decides. They will not do it. They'll drive a hard bargain. So what I see going forward is that it is a setback to the Belt and Road, but the sunk costs and the investment they've already made there and the assets they've already grabbed, they're not going to let go of them. And because these are 99-year lease is almost like perpetuity. So these are problems, and China to completely yank Sri Lanka out of the Chinese orbit is not going to be easy despite the crisis. My only hope is a people's movement. A people's movement is not only to restore democracy, but civil society in Sri Lanka must rise up and say that the foreign policy was also fundamentally flawed. That critique, I see less of it. Sometimes there have been protests against Chinese projects and what they're doing to Sri Lanka, but more and more we need that, and that's the only way they can come out of it. Otherwise, suppose they attain some kind of a balancing of books in a year or so, you could go back to the same old system. So unless people's pressure is there on the regime, multi-ethnic pressure from all sides, I'm afraid that the Belt and Road will continue to make inroads there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia, for taking your precious time in Pune, Maharashtra while you are on your book tour. I know that. And we are very delighted to have your perspective on this. And you did address first two questions in the chat function. I'm going to ask the next question to Dr. Sachithananthan, please. There were, invocation of number of complicating factors. The situation in Sri Lanka, the current instability, is a result of culmination of hundreds, if not thousands, years of ongoing dynamics. But more recently, nobody talked about the British imperial policy of divide and rule. It has been alleged that British enforced the same policy in Sri Lanka by favoring one community over the other, creating local hostilities. And I see Professor Nalapat shaking his head, but I would like actually Dr. Sachithananthan to comment on this, that it has been alleged that British were responsible for causing this separation and distance between ethno-religious communities in Sri Lanka. Because if you look at both the communities, the Tamil and Sri Lankan, Sinhalese community, are of Indian origin. Anybody who saw the picture of Jayawardena and anybody who saw a picture of one former Minister of External Affairs of India, S.N. Mishra, would fail to distinguish because they look exactly the same. So Sinhala community also has its ethnic origin in India. What do you want to say about British policy of divide and rule between Tamils of Sri Lanka and Sinhalese community in Sri Lanka?
You're right. Now any ruler will want to rule, continue his rule, continue his overlordship, and the British made this as a point of dividing and ruling us. But we should be intelligent enough. We have some 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years of civilized way of life, intellectual inputs, and we have discovered things which the British did not know, the Europe Western world did not know. We have done so many things in this. But why we gave in to the British manipulative efforts is our mistake. We made a mistake of giving in to the British manipulative efforts. And in turn, we are reaping the what we saw. So to say that no, British did not divide us is wrong. We gave in. We knowingly, unknowingly gave in to the maneuverings of the British rule, and we are reaping the what we saw. So it's nothing but they will want to rule. No, they tried in India. The Indian Hindu leadership in India was very, very generous and magnanimous, allowing the Muslims to have their own country. Now, two countries. But Sri Lanka, the Buddhists did not appreciate very much the presence of Muslims in addition to the British. So, that's a Hindu country, that's a Tamil country. The entire island was Tamil island, the entire island was a Hindu island. There's nothing to, nobody can dispute that. But 1,000 years ago, there was no Sinhalese language worthy of mentioning in literature. It's only about 800 years ago they had a first book in the Sinhalese language. Before that, they were writing in Pali only. They were writing in Pali. Their Mahavansa was never written in Sinhalese. Mahavansa was written in Pali. Most of their work, and most of the work was written in Pali because the Tamil scholars went from India. Buddha was a Tamil scholar who went from Tamil Nadu and wrote it for them. They themselves would have been isolated if they had remained without the contact from India. So we as an entire island fell into the hands of the British truck, and we are working. We are reaping those benefits, whatever it is. But it is very difficult unless otherwise Sri Lanka engages itself in a basic primary production drive of producing agriculture. Its own food it has to produce. It has to produce its own food and export it. So, and then it has to produce its own clothes. Food, clothing, and shelter should be on its own. Then we can import things like digitization and integrate it into, like India is doing, like China is doing. We can integrate it into our system, but we basically are thinking that we should import everything. And they say it's a dollar crisis. It's not a dollar crisis. It's a laziness crisis. People are lazy to produce, and they are depending on all these freebies, and eventually saying dollar crisis. So how can there be a dollar crisis when you produce? There will be, in fact, you will have excess dollar.
Thank you, Dr. Sachithananthan, for taking that question. There are no more questions in the chat function, so I'll ask the last question to Professor Nalapat. And it is about, you had mentioned about, LTTE and Prabhakaran being subsequently hated by the Tamil Sri Lankan community. One of the factors in dividing the wedge, people have alleged, is Norway. Norway is a small country that punches above its weight in international relations. And the specific footprints they leave everywhere in the world is Christian evangelism. And they had a lot to do with Christianizing the LTTE movement, which was originally a Hindu and Tamil movement which got Christianized and became fundamentalist to the extent that Prabhakaran converted and his family became Christian. Any comments on the role of international destabilizers contributing to the current situation in Sri Lanka, Professor Nalapat?
Well, I'd like to say that Dr. Sachithananthan is quite right that whatever takes place, it's up to us to be resilient and to resist that. As far as the Norwegians were concerned, they were definitely working very hard, including the European Union and public opinion wherever they could find it, to protect and preserve Prabhakaran's life. I have no idea why, but they had a soft corner for him and for the LTT, and there was tremendous pressure on on Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya, who was then the defense secretary, to allow Prabhakaran to escape in a boat or something, and so that there was even a promise that he would be brought to the Hague. But the reality is, multiple times in the past, as Mahinda Rajapaksa, one thing he has done, he has studied the mistakes made by the Bandaranaike case and the Jayawardhanes. And one of the mistakes made by the Bandaranaike case, and of course, late subsequently, was to ensure that whenever they had cornered the LTT, they would allow the LTT to escape under some kind of a peace offer brokered from outside. This time, they did not listen to any peace offer, and unfortunately, of course, there was a horrible loss of civilian life also, because the LTT used civilians as shields. I'm not saying that Tamils, look, the fact is Prabhakaran in the 1980s performed a very important function of essentially ensuring that the way the Sinhala chauvinists were just trampling on Tamil rights, Prabhakaran came as a force against that, and that created a feeling in them that you just can't trample over Tamil rights, otherwise this kind of a situation will come again. From that time onwards, there has been a certain a much better treatment of Tamil rights. I'm not saying it's good or perfect, but much better treatment thanks to the LTT. Even after the LTT went, they didn't want a new LTT to come back. So in that sense, but regarding Sri Lanka, I'd like to say Norway, frankly, I was always amazed at the way they were so determined to protect Prabhakaran. I don't know if it's a religious factor. Frankly, I've been to Europe multiple times. I don't see too many religious people there. If you go to a church, you don't see too many people in the church. Maybe they're religious at home, but not in the church. But Having said that, I'd like to say, I want to take off from what Dr. Chaulia said. Sri Lanka's positioning is such that India, United States, Australia, and Japan absolutely have to have Sri Lanka on its side. And frankly, I said this before, frankly, the same way that Russia moved against Ukraine when Ukraine was going to ally with NATO, because Ukraine is the land bridge for an army invasion of Russia. We would have to act if Sri Lanka goes with China. And frankly, 99 years, 99 months, if you're a sovereign country, a sovereign debt is defined by the sovereign country. And if the government is supported by other governments, you can repudiate the entire debt. And I honestly believe that Sri Lanka needs to repudiate this horribly high priced debt and walk away from it. And I'm sure India, and then if Sri Lanka takes a clear decision to support the Quad, to support India, to support a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And as far as the Rajapaksas are concerned, they are survivors. If
Thank
they
you,
believe
Professor Nalapat,
survival
for your
is with
answer.
US, they will go with the US and with any other country. But of course, I don't, from their point of view, I think they are in deep trouble. But I do hope Sri Lanka will recover. And very importantly, it has got to be part of the architecture of freedom in the Indo-Pacific.
So we are running short of time. I thank all our three distinguished guests, Professor Nalapat, Professor Chaulia, and Dr. K. Sachithananthan. I also thank our audience for participating in this discussion. Our program has been recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Lastly, I must thank the team CSA, Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, Mr. Ankush Bhandari, and Mr. Rajiv Verma for working on the back to make this possible. And we shall meet again in 2 weeks' time for our distinguished lecture series. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm very grateful for you participating in this program.